Imagine working hard your entire life, saving every penny, investing wisely, only to wake up one day and realize that everything you have built is being quietly taken from you. Not through a tax hike, not through theft, but through an invisible system designed to transfer your wealth without you ever noticing. This is financial repression. And it is one of the most effective tools governments use to control economies, pay off debt, and keep citizens obedient. Most people have never heard of it, but it's been shaping your life since the day you opened your first bank account. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments, what country are you watching from, and what time is it where you are? It's fascinating to see how this story connects us all. And while you're here, if you want to understand how the system really works, not the version they show on TV, make sure to subscribe. Because what you're about to learn will change how you see your savings, your retirement, and your financial freedom. To understand financial repression, you first need to understand a simple truth about governments. They always spend more than they earn. They borrow to fund wars, social programs, bailouts, and votes. And that debt never really goes away. It just grows, decade after decade. But here's the problem. If a government has too much debt, it faces two choices: default or destroy the debt through inflation. Default means political suicide. Inflation, on the other hand, is quiet. It's sneaky. It looks like rising prices, but it's actually the slow transfer of your wealth to the state. That's where financial repression comes in. It's a strategy that combines low interest rates, high inflation, and tight capital controls to slowly erode the real value of debt, while trapping savers like you in a system that guarantees losses. Here's how it works. When you deposit money in a savings account, you expect to earn interest. But in a repressed financial system, the government and central bank work together to keep interest rates artificially low, often below the rate of inflation. That means if inflation is 4% and your savings earn 2%, you're losing 2% of your purchasing power every year. You're not being paid for your savings. You're being taxed through stealth. And unlike regular taxes, there's no vote, no bill, no announcement. It happens automatically. Every year, the real value of your money shrinks. Over time, the government's massive debt pile becomes cheaper to pay off. The savers, the pensioners, the retirees, they bear the cost. It sounds like a conspiracy, but it's not. It's economic policy. After World War II, the United States and the United Kingdom both used financial repression to manage enormous debt loads. Central banks kept interest rates far below inflation for years. Governments introduced strict regulations that forced pension funds and banks to hold government bonds, ensuring a steady flow of cheap credit. Savers were trapped. Their returns didn't keep up with inflation, but they had nowhere else to go. By the 1950s, debt-to-GDP ratios were falling rapidly, not because governments paid their bills, but because inflation quietly wiped out the real value of what they owed. This was the hidden genius of the system. The pain was spread slowly, invisibly, across millions of ordinary people. No protests, no panic. Just a slow drain of wealth from the private sector to the public one. If you were alive back then, you wouldn't have seen it. You would have just noticed that life was getting more expensive and your savings weren't stretching as far. Now fast forward to today, global debt has reached levels never seen before. In the United States, it's over $34 trillion. Worldwide, it's more than 300% of GDP. There's no realistic path to paying that back. So what's the solution? The same one they've used before. Repress interest rates, print money, and let inflation do the dirty work. In 2020, when central banks cut rates to zero and flooded markets with liquidity, they didn't just save the system, they reset it. For governments drowning in debt, this is the perfect scenario. Inflation runs at 5 or 6%, wages rise slowly, and savers lose quietly. The debt, in real terms, gets smaller. You might think, well, I can just invest in assets like stocks or real estate, but that's part of the design. When cash loses value, people are pushed into risky assets to protect themselves. This inflates markets and helps governments too. Rising asset prices create a wealth effect. People feel richer, they spend more, and economies keep spinning. But here's the catch. Those who already own assets benefit the most. The wealthy get wealthier, while everyone else runs faster just to stand still. It's not an accident. It's the structure of modern capitalism, built on inflation, debt, and financial repression. You might ask, why not just raise interest rates? Because doing that would crash the system. Governments can't afford high interest rates. Every percentage point increase adds billions in interest payments on public debt. That's why central banks pretend inflation is transitory, even when it's not. They know the truth. They can't stop it without bankrupting their own governments. So they let it run. And while they do, your savings burn. The cruel part is how they disguise it. They tell you inflation is a sign of a growing economy. They say low interest rates are good for investment. They say everything is under control. But behind those polished statements lies the real policy. Inflate the debt away, keep savers trapped, and make sure no one escapes the system. Capital controls make it hard to move your wealth offshore. Regulations ensure banks hold government bonds, and financial markets are designed to reward speculation, not saving. It's not chaos, it's control. This isn't new, it's the oldest trick in the book. Only now, it's global. Every major central bank from Washington to Tokyo to London is doing it. And every saver, investor, and worker is caught in the same web. To see how deep this strategy runs, you need to look at history's biggest experiments with financial repression. After World War II, Britain owed more than 250% of its GDP. It couldn't pay that debt off through growth or taxes alone, so it turned to inflation. Between 1945 and 1980, inflation averaged more than 6% a year, while the average yield on government bonds was below 3%. That gap, the difference between what savers earned and what prices rose, quietly erased half the nation as debt in real terms. There were no debt jubilees, no massive defaults, just decades of invisible confiscation. The government pretended to protect savers, but in reality, it was feeding on them. The policy worked politically because few people understood what was happening. The numbers in their bank accounts stayed the same, only the purchasing power vanished. The United States used the same method. After the war, American debt was more than 120% of GDP. But instead of austerity, policymakers chose what economists politely call financial repression. By capping interest rates through Federal Reserve regulations, they ensured that inflation would run ahead of yields. Between 1946 and 1956, real interest rates were negative almost every year. By the time the 1950s ended, U.S. debt had fallen below 60% of GDP, not through fiscal discipline, but through stealth confiscation. Every saver paid for the government's war bills without realizing it. This is the genius of financial repression. It uses inflation as a weapon, low interest rates as the delivery system, and trust as the camouflage. Governments can present themselves as responsible stewards while quietly draining private wealth. And because it happens slowly, people don't revolt, they adjust. They blame markets, corporations, or bad luck. They never realize that the system itself is built to extract. The same playbook is running today. Since 2008, central banks have printed more than $30 trillion globally. They call it quantitative easing, but that's a euphemism. It's money creation, pure and simple. The new money flows first to banks, asset managers, and governments. By the time it reaches ordinary people, prices have already risen. The result is predictable. Asset inflation at the top, cost of living inflation at the bottom. The wealthy watch their portfolios double while savers earn near zero returns. The middle class bears the brunt. Their wages lag, their rent climbs, and their retirement savings erode. You might wonder why citizens don't protest. The reason is psychological. Inflation is confusing. It's not a single event, like a tax hike or a bill. It creeps. It's the silent subtraction of value, the erosion of memory. You can point to a single day when your money became worthless. It just happens gradually until one day you realize what you lost. That's why financial repression is so effective. It doesn't look like theft. It feels like bad luck. The policy depends on compliance. People must keep their savings inside the system. That's why governments and central banks discourage alternative stores of value. They mock gold as a relic, dismiss Bitcoin as speculation, and regulate capital flows to make sure your wealth can't leave. In the 20th century, countries like the UK and the US even banned gold ownership at times. Today, they use regulation and surveillance to monitor transactions. You're free to save as long as you save in the assets they control. And make no mistake, control is the point. Financial repression isn't just about debt management. It's about dependency. When citizens rely on the state for economic stability, they're easier to govern. You work, you save, you pay taxes, and the system quietly reclaims what's yours. The government doesn't need to seize property or raise taxes directly. It just manipulates the value of money until the outcome is the same. Let's take Japan as an example. For decades, the Japanese government has kept interest rates near zero. Savers earn almost nothing, while inflation targets remain modest. The policy allows Tokyo to sustain debt levels exceeding 250% of GDP, the highest in the developed world. Japanese citizens still believe they're secure, but their purchasing power has stagnated for a generation. Their savings finance the state, not their future. And because capital controls and domestic institutions dominate the market, there's no escape. The same story plays out in Europe. The European Central Bank spent nearly a decade holding rates below zero. Pension funds struggled, retirees were forced into riskier investments, and governments borrowed freely. By the time inflation surged in the early 2020s, it was too late. Rates rose, but debts were larger than ever. The system trapped itself. Central banks couldn't normalize policy without triggering a financial crisis, so they accepted inflation as the lesser evil. For the average European, that meant higher prices, weaker pensions, and smaller savings. The quiet cost of keeping the system alive. Now, imagine this mechanism operating on a global scale. The United States issues the world's reserve currency, so its policies ripple everywhere. When the Federal Reserve suppresses rates, it doesn't just affect Americans, it forces the entire planet into the same trap. Emerging markets see their currencies weaken, capital flees to the dollar, and foreign debts rise in cost. The result is a global architecture of repression, one built not on coercion, but on dependency. Every central bank takes cues from Washington, every investor follows dollar signals, and every saver ends up holding assets that lose value in real terms. Financial repression works best when people believe it's temporary. Politicians and economists always promise that low rates or money printing are short-term measures. They never are. Once a government becomes addicted to cheap debt, it can't quit. Every crisis becomes an excuse for more intervention. Every recession justifies more liquidity. The longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to unwind. And every step of the way, your wealth buys a little less. There's a cruel irony in how the system sells itself. You're told to save, you're told to invest responsibly, you're told that patience and prudence will pay off, but in a repressed financial order, those virtues are punished. The reckless speculator thrives, while the cautious saver bleeds. That is the moral rot at the heart of the system. It rewards those who play the game, not those who build value. It's no wonder trust in money is collapsing. But if you think the system is unstable, you're right. Financial repression can last for decades, but it always ends the same way, in crisis. Inflation erodes confidence, citizens seek escape, and eventually the state loses control. That's when history turns violent. Every empire that mastered financial repression eventually faced its reckoning. Rome debased its silver coins to fund endless wars. At first, citizens barely noticed. Prices rose slowly and soldiers were still paid. But over time, trust collapsed. Merchants demanded more coins for the same goods, soldiers refused debased pay, and the empire's trade networks broke down. What started as a clever fiscal policy ended as economic ruin. The same cycle repeats in modern times. When you corrupt money, you corrupt everything built upon it. Trade, savings, trust, and ultimately, civilization itself. Modern governments think they're smarter. They believe they can print, suppress, and manipulate without consequence because they have spreadsheets and PhDs. But the math doesn't change. Every time you force real interest rates below inflation, you plant the seeds of collapse. The only question is how long it takes to grow. In the post-COVID era, we saw the perfect storm. Trillions in stimulus flooded the world economy, central banks held rates at zero, and inflation roared back. At first, officials dismissed it as transitory. But by the time reality hit, the damage was done. Savers had lost years of real returns. Housing, food, and energy costs exploded. And the middle class, already fragile, found itself squeezed from every direction. This is the unspoken truth. Inflation is not a bug. It's the plan. When governments borrow too much, they need inflation to reduce the real burden of debt. They just need it to rise slightly faster than interest rates. Not too much to trigger panic, just enough to quietly siphon wealth. It's a balancing act between deceit and disaster. But history shows that balance never lasts. Eventually, inflation escapes control. People rush into real assets, land, commodities, gold, Bitcoin, anything the government can't print. And once confidence cracks, no decree can restore it. Financial repression thrives on illusion. The illusion of stability, the illusion of control. As long as citizens believe the system is fair, they'll play along. But when they realize the game is rigged, they start looking for exits. That's when policymakers panic. They impose capital controls, wealth taxes, and digital restrictions. They tell you it's about fighting crime or protecting the system. But the real motive is always the same: to trap capital inside a dying currency. The rise of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, is the next step in this evolution. With programmable money, authorities could enforce negative interest rates directly, restrict how you spend, or even expire your savings to force consumption. It's the ultimate tool of repression, a financial prison disguised as convenience. Think about it. In the old days, if your bank paid near zero interest, you could withdraw cash and hold it yourself. That physical option created a floor beneath rates. But in a world of digital-only money, there's no escape. Every dollar, euro, or yen becomes traceable, taxable, and, if necessary, deletable. Governments can drain wealth invisibly and instantly. Combine that with inflation, and you have total control. A system where citizens own nothing real and every asset is denominated in melting ice. We've been here before. In the 1970s, after decades of repression, the US dollar's tether to gold finally snapped. Inflation surged, interest rates spiked, and the illusion of stability shattered. It took painful recessions and double-digit rates to restore trust. But here's the warning. Today's debts are far larger, and today's citizens far more dependent. A return to honest rates would bankrupt governments, implode markets, and wipe out pension systems. So instead, policymakers will likely double down. More stimulus, more printing, more control. They'll promise price stability while quietly eroding everything you own. For the average person, this creates a paradox. You're told to save, but savings lose value. You're told to invest, but markets are inflated by policy, not productivity. You're told the system is fair, yet it punishes prudence. So what can you do? Awareness is the first defense. Once you recognize financial repression for what it is, a stealth tax on savers, you can adjust. Diversify beyond fiat currency. Hold assets tied to real value, commodities, productive land, businesses with tangible output. These aren't just investments, they're forms of escape. But the deeper question is moral. What happens to a society when honesty no longer pays? When thrift is punished and speculation rewarded? That's where we are today. A generation has grown up believing that wealth comes from leverage, not labor. Governments cheer it on because bubbles create the illusion of prosperity. But illusions can't last forever. Every suppressed rate is a future crisis postponed. Every dollar printed is trust borrowed from tomorrow. And one day, the bill always comes due. In the end, financial repression is a symptom, not the disease. The disease is political cowardice, the refusal to confront debt with discipline, to tell voters the truth, to live within limits. Printing and repression are shortcuts, and like all shortcuts, they lead to cliffs. The people who suffer most aren't the powerful. They're the savers, the pensioners, the workers who played by the rules. Their wealth is quietly transferred upward, and when the system breaks, they're told it's unexpected. But there's nothing unexpected about math. If you zoom out, you'll see the pattern. Every time debt overwhelms an empire, it turns to inflation. Every time inflation erodes trust, the empire tightens control. And every time control reaches its peak, the people find a way out. A new money, a new system, a new beginning. Rome fell, Britain's pound lost its crown, and one day the dollar will face the same fate. The question isn't if, it's when. So the next time you hear a central banker say, inflation is under control, or real rates will remain low, understand what they're really saying. They're admitting the plan. Your savings are collateral. Your future is their funding source. And the longer you stay in their game, the more you'll lose. But here's the hopeful part. Knowledge is leverage. Once you understand how financial repression works, you can act outside its reach. You can build value in the real world, in skills, assets, and relationships no policy can inflate away. That's the true rebellion. The system counts on your ignorance. It